Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Honest. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. Inflation has dropped to just 1.2% per year. According to real-time price aggregator Truflation, that's about as good as it gets outside a recession, given we have a Federal Reserve who spends trillions making inflation. So Truflation dropped the number last Thursday, and it's much lower than official CPI of about 2.7% year-on-year. Now, it's worth noting, Truflation normally correlates 97% with official CPI, as in they're not wacky. In fact, Truflation was higher than official numbers under Biden. So Truflation peaked at 17% during Bidenflation when official CPI said just 9%. Still, they're very different at the moment, 1.2 versus 2.7, so who is the real inflation? So there's three big differences between Truflation and the official numbers: timing, weights, and the retarded way the Bureau of Labor Statistics counts housing. So Truflation monitors 35 million prices in real time, scraping the data directly, while the Bureau of Labor Statistics literally sends out secret shoppers every couple of weeks like it's the 1920s. This means that Truflation is counting 350 times more prices, and it also means that they're real time while the BLS is delayed by more than a month. Second is weights. Every inflation index has to decide how much to weigh stuff. So if your rent doubled but your eggs dropped in half, what does that come to? The BLS uses a single in-house survey, while Truflation has a bunch of data including census updates, real-time credit card and transaction flows, or Nielsen's expenditure surveys. These are pretty close on most things except the single biggest thing Americans spend on: housing. CPI gives housing a 1/3 weight, but Truflation is just 1 in 4. That makes everything else way more in Truflation. So if gasoline or eggs are coming down as they are now, it's a bigger deflation in the Truflation numbers. But the kicker here is it's actually housing that's coming down the most right now, along with rents. So I mentioned in recent videos how the housing market is finally unfreezing after years of high Fed rates that had locked people in. Even bigger is deportations, where 2.5 million illegals have apparently freed up a lot of housing. Illegals tend to rent, and November rents nationwide were down annualized double digits. Home prices are actually falling now in deportation-heavy cities like Austin and Miami. But it's not just the weights, it's the bizarre way BLS counts housing. So instead of actually measuring house prices and rents, the BLS cooks up an imaginary number called owner equivalent rent to guess what if you rented your house to yourself. Then they delay that number by 6 to 12 months on the logic that rents don't renegotiate every month. But of course, imaginary rents can renegotiate in fractions of a second. This is like saying people keep their cars for 8 years, so let's use 2018 car prices. This also means the official numbers ignored the single biggest source of inflation under Biden, housing, and they're also ignoring the single biggest source of deflation under Trump. And we'll keep ignoring it through 2027, as in past the midterms. So what's next? Low inflation is a welcome change, but Americans didn't vote for prices that are a little bit higher than Biden. They actually want lower prices, deflation. Trump has been throwing the executive order kitchen sink at costs in energy, housing, food, and healthcare, but the heavy lifting has to come from Congress: the price hiking regulations, the environmental mandates, the federal spending. Until that happens, voters may hear low inflation, but they'll still feel like everything's ridiculously expensive. How did Venezuela collapse, and what does it mean for emerging socialist hellholes like the European Union? Venezuela has given us a play-by-play how the warm embrace of collectivism takes you from one of the richest countries in the world to one of the poorest, where people eat garbage. So back in the 1970s, Venezuela was one of the richest countries in the world, richer than Spain, Ireland, Italy, or Japan. It was 3 times richer than Singapore. Famously, Venezuela was the number 2 market for Ford F-150s after the United States. And then they elected socialists, who nationalized the oil industry, promising to share Venezuela's natural bounty with the people. Of course, corrupt socialists simply absconded with the windfall, while the nationalized oil industry was driven close to bankruptcy. By the 1980s, Venezuela was going to the IMF hat in hand. Poverty was over half the population, and mass riots killed hundreds in Caracas. And our strongman Hugo Chavez, promising a Bolivarian revolution that would end corruption and inequality once and for all. He promised to use oil revenue for free housing, free healthcare, free education, and to create millions of jobs. Instead, once again, the socialists simply redirected the corruption. Chavez's daughter famously is a billionaire to this day, while the economy imploded even harder, to the point hungry Venezuelans were pillaging farm trucks. In a 2-year period, GDP dropped by nearly a quarter, which is Great Depression level. Inflation soared to 40%, and then Chavez died, and it got worse. Power went to Chief Lieutenant Maduro, the guy Trump just grabbed, who doubled down on central planning and political repression. The economy cratered by 75%, inflation hit 65,000%. Hungry Venezuelans went from looting food trucks and supermarkets to scavenging garbage dumps to feed their kids. The power went off daily in what was once one of the biggest oil producers on Earth. In 2019, the entire country was blacked out for 10 days. That doesn't even happen in Africa. Regular police collapsed since they weren't being paid, so cities became war zones, with the only functioning police being the secret police, locking up dissidents. 1 in 5 Venezuelans fled the country, some to the U.S., many to shanty towns in Colombia, which Venezuelans used to look down on as third world. Meanwhile, Maduro turned a blind eye to drug trafficking to the U.S. since it generated the cash for his regime, and doubtless pleased his sponsors in China and Iran, who enjoy watching the flower of America's youth sprawled out on the sidewalk on fentanyl. Maduro is now in DEA custody. His minions are still in charge, but they're apparently taking orders from Marco Rubio lest they too get scooped up by Delta Force. And Trump's already floated a similar liberation of Cuba as early as this year. But more broadly, the writing is on the wall for Latin American socialists funding their secret police by flooding America with fentanyl. So what's next? For countries like Europe, who are just starting down the road to serious socialism, the biggest lesson is the road from prosperity to eating out of trash dumps is a lot shorter than it looks. Europe's decline is slower, but socialism is always headed to the same place: corruption, repression, and starvation. Perhaps the most important takeaway from Venezuela is you can vote your way into socialism, but you have to shoot your way out. Sometimes America is kind enough to do the shooting for you, but a nuclear-armed Europe would have to do it themselves. A word from our sponsor. If you own gold, and many of you do, you already understand how it protects your wealth from the insanity coming out of Washington. The inflation, the recessions, the wars. But with monetary metals, there's a way to actually earn a yield of up to 4% on your gold, paid in more ounces of gold. You retain ownership of real, allocated physical gold with no storage costs while your ounces grow every month outside the banking system. If you're serious about protecting your future and building your legacy, head to monetarymetals.com/Peter to get started. Now back to our show. New data from the Federal Reserve says household wealth grew by $12 trillion in just 9 months under Trump, which translates to an annualized 10% growth after inflation, coming to nearly $20,000 for the median family in just 9 months, which is roughly 20 times better than Joe Biden's annual tally. Put different, in 9 months, Trump has delivered 4 times the household wealth of Biden's 4 years. In fact, it's even better than Trump's first term, when incomes grew almost 7% per year, even with COVID. The tally comes from my based colleague EJ Antoni, and it brings median household wealth to $192,000. Now, what drove it is incredible growth in productivity, along with deportations, tax cuts, and the most deregulation in history. In recent videos, I've mentioned how we're currently growing north of 5%, better than China. Productivity, which is what makes us rich, is currently running 4.9%, which is among the best since the Reagan administration. This is all driving profits, which drive stock prices, with the S&P 500 up 15%, the Russell 2000 index of small companies up 17%. This could actually accelerate thanks to tax cuts in the Big Beautiful Bill and trillions of investment to get under Trump's Big Beautiful Tariff umbrella. The stock boom was good for over $9 trillion in mutual funds, pensions, stock portfolios, and private companies, some mom and pops and small businesses that are sprouting up with lower deregulation. Another $500 billion was gold and silver thanks to Washington's drunkest spenders. Toss in $1 trillion in bond gains and consumer durables as rates drops and incomes rise. And finally, housing, which has leveled off but was still good for roughly $2 trillion in wealth. Now, these are spectacular numbers, but of course, a lot of Americans are not doing spectacular. A recent study by Bank of America estimates 1 in 4 American households are living paycheck to paycheck, spending 95% or more of their income on essentials: housing, food, utilities, gas, and debt. The Federal Reserve estimates 37% of American adults cannot cover a $400 emergency. Other estimates like LendingTree are even higher. So there's 2 keys for these people: lower prices and higher incomes. Yesterday's video, I talked about what Washington can do on prices, so cut spending, slash crony regulations in healthcare, and environmental mandates that drive up housing, food, and energy. But the other part is raising incomes for low-income households. There's also 2 parts here: raise wages and get people off the couch and into a job. So real wages have been soaring under Trump, thanks to that growth and 2.5 million deportations where Americans take the job at twice the pay. But there's still roughly 10 million working-age Americans who are not working. The biggest lever here is benefits, the $1.5 trillion empire of welfare that pays millions to kick back and let the rest of us cover their bills or their cash pallets to Somalia. Trump is trying his best to cut off the fraud, but it takes Congress to actually cut benefits to the able-bodied and get them back to work. But to be fair, Congress did trim Medicaid for the able-bodied in the Big Beautiful Bill, but there's $1.5 trillion to go. So what's next? In 1 year, Trump turned 4 years of Bidenflation into soaring wealth, soaring wages, and soaring jobs. Now Congress needs to finish the job. The Department of Justice just announced murders fell to a 125-year low. As in, the last time murders were this low, Queen Victoria sat on the throne, Australia did not exist, Canada was brand new, and we had just invaded Qing Dynasty China in the Boxer Rebellion. So last week, the FBI announced murders fell 21%, taking it to a 125-year low, accurately calling it the largest drop ever. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt added, quote, "This is what happens when you have a president who fully mobilizes federal law enforcement." The drop completely erased the pandemic-era orgy of violence driven by defund the police activists and federal obstruction by Biden's handlers. In fact, murders are down 25% compared to 2019. It's not just murder. Burglaries were down 17%, robbery 23%, car theft 27%, carjacking was down 43%. So what drove it? Legacy media, of course, tried to spin it as a routine bounce back from the pandemic violence they themselves midwifed, which is false when it's 25% lower than pre-pandemic. Shockingly, media lied. What actually drove it was almost entirely Trump. After sealing the border and blowing up narco boats to the point they don't even try anymore, Trump 180'd the Department of Justice from Biden-era consent decrees that actually tied the hands of local police to instead flooding the zone with 150,000 federal agents plus the National Guard. That roughly doubles the number of detectives working on violent crime nationwide. To give a flavor, one single executive order on federal-local task forces correlated with a 15% increase in murder clearance. Finally, targeting criminal gangs like MS-13 drove drops of 25 to 30% in murders. In short, federal local police are now going after violent criminals instead of arresting J6 grandmas and people who pray at abortion clinics. Number 2 was, of course, ICE, which deported roughly 500,000 criminals, 70% of deportations, plus hundreds of thousands more among the 2 million self-deportations, considering criminals would be the most eager to avoid getting picked up by ICE. So we're talking 700,000 criminals deported, possibly more. This makes a big impact since studies say roughly 1% of criminals commit 60% of violent crime. And finally, the economy. I've mentioned in recent videos how blue-collar wages are rising at 6 decades highs. GDP itself is currently growing faster than China, and 2 million Americans found jobs this year, in many cases replacing illegals at twice the pay. So when you can make $20 an hour at Costco, it keeps you off the streets, and it gives you something to lose for sucker punching people at the mall. So as next, this is incredible progress for a single year, but crime is still about 10 times too high, going by countries like Finland or Switzerland that have plenty of guns and almost zero crime. Big reason is left-wing judges who release criminals after dozens of convictions, along with pro-criminal reforms pushed by the left in the 1960s that tilted the balance for criminals and against victims. Fixing it could mean making it easier to impeach these judges or make the judges liable for subsequent crimes. It could also mean nationwide 3 strikes laws with teeth, nationwide truth in sentencing laws to keep them in prison, or ending blue city bail rules that release shoplifters and violent felons. In crime, as in so many of our nation's problems, Trump is having a massive impact with executive orders alone, but it takes Congress to finish the job. A word from our sponsor. One of the best ways to secure your Bitcoin is with a hardware wallet, a physical device that lets you keep your coins offline without internet connection. One of the most trusted names in hardware wallets is CoinKite, maker of the famous block clock. CoinKite devices are made in Canada and they're run by passionate Bitcoiners who've been at this since 2012, back when Bitcoiners were trading in person at swap meets. You can pick up hardware wallets and plenty of other goodies at coinkite.com/ProfSaintAnge. That's CoinKite.com/ProfSaintAnge. Okay, back to our show. Germany's economy, the powerhouse of Europe, grew for the first time in 4 years by a laughable 0.2%, and even that was bought with government money. Meanwhile, the U.S. is growing at 5.5% faster than China, so 27 times faster than Germany. Alas, Germany's 15 minutes of growth won't last given their crushing energy problems, crushing migrant crisis, and the fact Donald Trump is stealing Europe's industrial crown jewels, the ones that form the backbone of the German economy, in fact, the European economy. First, the numbers. German statistics agency Destatis reported GDP grew 0.2% last year. That's the entire year. Still, that's big in Germany considering they actually shrank since 2019, 7 lost years. This matters because Germany is nearly a third of industrial production in the EU, with a lot of the rest being German subcontractors in places like Poland or Belgium. So why is Germany on its knees? 3 big reasons: energy, China, and an out-of-control bureaucracy. German energy prices skyrocketed after pink-haired environmentalists shuttered gigawatts of coal and nuclear, and then Russian energy strangled over the Ukraine war. Now, this is exactly what Trump warned them would happen back in 2018 to raucous sneers from German diplomats. German energy prices are now nearly 3 times that of U.S. manufacturing states like Tennessee or North Carolina, which is tough on German households, but it cripples industries like steel, cars, and chemicals. Number 2 is China, which went from export paradise for German companies to dumping what it can't sell in the U.S. That turned a $25 billion surplus with China in 2019 to a $90 billion deficit today. So in U.S. GDP terms, that's like going from a $200 billion trade surplus to a $600 billion deficit. Finally, regulation, where Germany's empire of red tape is sinking the entire economy, especially small business. Regulatory compliance in Germany consumes 1 in 5 employee hours. That's 2 to 4 times what it does in the U.S. And the rule of thumb in regulation is total costs are about 7 times compliance. Implying red tape is cutting the German economy in half. The last year alone, Germany lost over 500,000 jobs. In U.S. terms, that's 2 million jobs. Worse, Germany replaced them with 200,000 additional bureaucrats to suck the life out of what businesses survive. Germany's already poorer than Louisiana and growing 0.2% every 7 years. It is on its way to West Virginia. So it's next. It's about to get worse for Germany because Trump is actively stealing their crown jewels with the carrot of lower taxes and regulations and the stick of tariffs. Since Trump took office, BMW, Volkswagen, and Mercedes have all announced plans to move to Alabama and South Carolina, along with hundreds of suppliers and giants from chemicals and pharma to industrial machinery and cranes. Unfortunately for Germans and Europeans, there is no help on the way. The pink-haired Greens own European energy, while China's dump fest is not ending anytime soon. As for the red tape, government bureaucrats and state-funded enterprises now make up 1 in 5 voters in Germany, comparable to Social Security recipients in the U.S. So like Social Security in the U.S., cutting government in Germany and Europe is effectively a political third rail. Europe's best hope is a U.S. that does so well that European voters wake up and vote themselves out of socialism while there's still a functioning economy left. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersanons.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.